Hello everyone, welcome to the last week in our journey through the lifespan in developmental psychology, and we reach the end of the lifespan where we talk about death and dying. I've been talking a little bit about it in late adulthood because we talked about the process by which people start to contemplate. Now we're going to start talking about the actual process of death and take a look at some of those details as we take on Chapter 10, Death and Dying. Now, I want to do a little plug in my department. We do have a class called Death and Dying. SOC 203, a very fascinating class. A number of people have been involved in the development of the material for this class. It is offered every semester. It's offered online, and occasionally we offer it face-to-face. Great instructors, and they approach this not only really from the psychological point of view, but the sociological point of view, the cultural aspect of death and dying and what it means in terms of our society. A little bit of what, kind of how I incorporated it into my own class, not really getting into the process of the actual physical death part, but how it impacts people around them. How does society interpret that? How do we prepare for those what institutions exist to support this this thing that we all are going for? That's the end of all of our lives. So we have a class. If you're interested in learning lots of detail about it, this is a great class to take particularly for healthcare, but really for just, it's a shared experience, and the more we know about it, the more we can come to terms with it, the better off that we are. So let's take a look here at kind of the images and all the kinds of words and terms that we use. This comes right out of my sociology class itself when we look at lifespan within the sociological frame of reference here. And we have images. You see on the left side of this table, we have images and objects that are about death and dying. A flag at half staff, sympathy cards, tombstones, monuments. Then we have events, gatherings of individuals, funerals, family gatherings, memorial services, viewings, wakes, those kinds of things. And then we have statistics, being the the mortality rates and such, that we have those things, number of age patients that died, murder and suicide rates, life expectancy rates, those kinds of things. And then we have these words that we use instead of the word dead. We use in a time of waiting, nothingness, passing on, passing away, going home, those kinds of things. And you see that our language and our culture is rich with symbolism about this shared event. Death is a part, it's the end of it, it's the end of our life, but it's a part of it. So it's incredibly important for us to be able to have these frank discussions about death with ourselves and with the people around us. So here are some statistics that take a look at how this has been going on here. This is in the United States. We see the graph here in terms of the age-adjusted death rates, and we see the red areas are higher death rates, and then the lighter and the blue and all that are the lower death rates there. And then if we take a look really close here at this particularly, look at the date. This is 2016, the leading causes of death: heart disease, cancer, and then unintentional injuries and the diseases from that point on. And along comes COVID, and COVID accounted for just about as many deaths as heart disease and cancer in a single year. Now, it's not to minimize, certainly here we have this disease process that in 1 year matched the two top causes of death in the United States in just that year, but it also shines light on the idea that there's that many people dying of cancer and heart disease every year before and after COVID. So lots of death related to disease processes that are largely the effect of lifestyle. And, you know, some of the controversy about getting vaccinated or wearing masks and stuff like that are really conversations about lifestyle and sense of personal freedom of control over your lives and whatnot. Same as smoking, stressful lives, not exercising and all that lead to cancer and heart disease. It is pretty clear the pathway to a healthier life is pretty clear. Vaccinations, masks, healthy lifestyle, getting lots of sleep, exercising, avoiding too much of many things, and you can largely avoid these large causes of death, or at least, you know, make your statistics better. So it's interesting as a psychologist because when we compare causes of death to years ago, when most of the things that killed us were actually influenza, the plague, famine, those kinds of things, not that famine and disease don't happen around the world, and I don't need to be insensitive about that, but in the West, these things have been largely eliminated. And the things that actually get us in the end are things that are accumulated over a lifespan of a lifetime of poor habits that lead to heart disease, cancer. And in the short term, sometimes when we're not paying attention to health regulations in order to keep from spreading a disease like COVID. So just some factoids about that. Now, the next section that I want to talk about is when we look at death and dying from the developmental psych point of view, we kind of think, well, let's talk about people who are dying, and we will, but let's also talk about how our perception of death changes as we grow. You know, if I ask a person, let's go right back to the developmental perspective. You know, if I ask a person, what's your perception of death? And the answer is going to be largely dependent on the age of the individual. So if we had the general question, what are a person's perception of death? We can do the developmental perspective thing right from chapter 1 and say, well, how old is the person? And I say, well, they're in grade school, you know, they're 9. And we could look at, you know, what would a 9-year-old think about death? You know, cognitively in terms of the development of schemas, understanding the social world, understanding the magical world of imagination versus the real world. And all of those combine into the internal representations of death that a typical 9-year-old would have. So let's take a look. I've developed a little graphic here to kind of go over each one of these ages. And here we have, in general, it follows cognitive developmental paths and areas of emotional maturity. So if we look at infants and their perception of death, say there's an infant and somebody around them dies, their parent dies, or something like that, don't really understand death. And we understand that right up to a certain age, they don't even know when a person is gone. There's going to be no internal schema representation of that person. So not a real huge impact. Obviously, later on, when that child grows up and they recognize that they grew up without a parent or without, you know, they never met their grandparents or something like that, that's a different psychology. I mean, it's missing something you've never had kind of thing, and how that person processes that later on. But at the age of infancy, there's really no awareness of death and of missing individuals once they have passed away. Now look at early childhood. The death does not seem real and permanent. An individual may leave this earth, but there's a notion that they'll come back, or it's not permanent. And it's really interesting to kind of look at this from a socio-cultural point of view in terms of the magical thinking that we often see associated with many faiths and religion of there being an afterlife, and that individuals who are encountering adults, who are encountering young children, who are experiencing a death of someone they care about, can reinforce that notion of the individual still alive in a way in the afterlife, and therefore death doesn't have that permanent quality to it. Yet at the same time, other children who are not growing up with those sort of social expectations or those kinds of teaching deal with it as they're gone forever. We will miss them. We hold them, we hold their memory. That's what's left of them. Those kinds of interesting characteristics of how adults interact with young children who are going through loss. One of the most interesting aspects of that is when it's actually a challenge to adulthood when your children are experiencing the death of somebody for the first time, that you kind of got to get your own ducks in a row. What do I believe and what am I going to be passing on to my children? So there's actually, when you look at this from the developmental perspective and we see a death in the family, a grandparent has died, and there's a young child, and there's a, mom and dad, or mom or dad, and they have to come to terms with the loss of their parent, and they have to come to terms with their own belief systems of what they're going to pass on to the children. Bare bones is this: honesty. They've died. This is what death is. Portraying whatever belief system, but saying something like, Grandpa's gone to Florida on vacation, and I have known families to do that, is really not the way to approach that. I mean, and I guess it kind of comes from research that's been done, but sort of pragmatics. Individuals, let's say, that lived on farms have often experienced at very young ages the death of animals, or that kind of thing, even on purpose, the slaughtering of animals for food or something like that. So they have a better grip on death and what it means, and as a process of life. Going to start hearing the Lion King coming at the circle of life and all that stuff. That they can get their head wrapped around that, and I think it's most important to react to this, even though cognitively, we're looking at very early childhood. Don't see it as being real or permanent, but we still portray those messages to our children, and take that opportunity to get our own cards stacked as to where our belief systems are in that area. So a good challenge there. Middle childhood, up to about age 9, there may still be some magical thinking associated with death. Late childhood, they got it. They understand the permanence of death. They probably, like late childhood, they've experienced that. The parents have gone ahead, or the caregivers have gone ahead and given explanations of that. They got the idea. Maybe they've lost a pet. Time allows for these lessons to be learned. In adolescence, one of the interesting things are the factors. Certainly they understand death as much as they did when they were younger. But there might be this personal fable thing, like it happens to others, but doesn't happen to me. So I'm kind of crossing over here into that, no pun intended, crossing over into this adult where we're starting to imagine that, not only what our perception is of death of other people, but our own death. And an adolescent, for example, will have a potential fallacy in their logic that we learned when we were learning about Elkind's work. And that fallacy of personal fable might be it's not going to happen, but that illusion of invulnerability or perceptions of this process that I'm unique in my experience of this death in my family and all that will play a role in how adolescents are dealing with death in the family, or potentially even with their own death. Young adults, not personally concerned with death for themselves, certainly developing adult attitudes toward the death of others. Middle adulthood, interestingly, that's where the most fear, more than youth, more than the elderly, fear of death. Again, this kind of goes along with that midlife event, becomes very real, and in late adulthood, actually experience less fear and anxiety about death than any other group. And so, interesting, these are grand generalizations, and it doesn't mean that there aren't people of all different ages that are going to think differently about these things. These are sort of the big numbers. This is what we would expect in normative development. There might be individuals at the end of their lives who are terrified and full of anxiety. It's not uncommon for individuals who are actively dying to be given medication for anxiety because they're experiencing fear. I mean, they're on the precipice of the end of their life, doubts, wonderings. At the same time, there might be other people. There was a person in the church that I used to go to. He was an elderly gentleman, and he talked actively about looking forward to it. His faith was very deep and very rich. He had no more friends alive. He was very old, and as a happy individual, felt that he had did the best life that he can, felt really good about going. And my understanding is that took him right to the end. He was smiling and said, here I go. I'm going to meet my Savior. And off he went without any presentation of fear or anxiety about that at all. So all kinds of ways in which people can experience the death of others and their own approaches to death. Now, one of the most famous models of the dying process itself was developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and her study very early in the, kind of in like the mid-1900s and whatnot, that era, she was working with people who were dying, and her observations led to the development of a cycle or stage theory about, and it's really, we have to be really careful about how we talk about. Let me describe these different states of mind that Kubler-Ross observed when people were dying, going through the dying process over a period of time, that she could categorize their general reaction in one of 5 ways. Now, at first, we might see that the individual, I hope you can see there's like a little yellow dot there, on denial. An individual finds out that they have a terminal illness and they don't believe it. No, it's not true. Can't happen to me. Those kinds of things. That can be the person's state of mind. Then they might move into a period of anger and frustration, irritation and anxiety about the fact that they have this terminal diagnosis, leading to depression where they're overwhelmed, feeling helpless, some hostility. They might want to run away, trying to escape the inevitability there. Bargaining with, looking to find meaning, or even reaching out to others and even reaching out to God and saying, give me a few more years and this is what I'll do, sort of telling their story, getting those things out there. And then finally, as the vast majority of individuals entering into a state of peace and acceptance with the end of their lives. And look underneath this graph. This is also in your course book. When during denial and anger, the blue bar on the bottom sort of shows the different reactions of caregivers. When someone's in denial and their anger, we're communicating. We open up those communications even though that individual might be resisting that communication. We provide emotional support, and then through the bargaining and acceptance periods, we have guidance and direction. Now, to the point I was making before, it's important to recognize that this is not and never was a linear process. Although you could possibly watch somebody go through each one of these stages, people can jump around and they can return to existing stages. They can return to existing stages in a matter of moments. You could be talking to someone and they can be, death is here and I need to accept it and I make peace with, and stuff like that. And the next moment they're angry, and then they're cutting deals with God, and then they're in denial, and they're just jumping all over the place. But what it accurately does, rather than chart the pathway to death, it identifies the different states of mind that people can be in while they are in the process of dying, and what we can do to support that individual while they're there. And that's what we do. You know, and I guess that's the real benefit of this particular theory here we have, is that blue bar. We know that people are going to be at any moment, if you're ever working in hospice services or something like that, which I'll talk about in just a minute, these are the kinds of supports that we would provide when we recognize that an individual is in a particular stage of the Kubler-Ross grief cycle. So, how does healthcare respond to this? And of course, many of you are going into healthcare and you're going to be experiencing this firsthand. Oftentimes, individuals experience death in the healthcare facility under the care of healthcare providers. And the vast majority of healthcare dollars are spent on individuals at the end of their lives. So these last two chapters, 9 and 10, aging in the elderly, and here with death and dying, is really the world of the majority of services provided in healthcare. And, you know, embracing the idea that in many ways you'll be helping people to maximize their life function at the end of their life. Now, healthcare has two perspectives in terms of disease processes: the curative care, which is to eliminate or fix the disease process. Palliative care is to provide comfort. We are not going to be able to beat the disease. Nature is taking its course. The death process has begun, and the focus of care is on comfort and providing those very elements of information, emotional support, and resources and whatnot as people are transitioning. The individual who's dying and the individuals around them that care for them. And so in what we see most of the time here, we're looking mostly at palliative care when we're in the death and dying process. In fact, the eligibility, if you don't have a notion of when people get onto hospice care, which is specifically palliative care, is the individual can't be simultaneously aggressively fighting the disease and on palliative care at the same time. I don't think that can happen. You know, insurance companies say either we're going to fight the disease or we're going to accept the process is inevitable and we'll provide you with the best comfort care possible. So enter in, here's the logo for Maine Hospice Council. The idea of hospice services is that these are specific medical services provided to individuals and their families to support them through the dying process. Now, one of the roles that I had when I was a social worker was to do some hospice work. I actually really ended up not doing a lot of it, and most of what I did was actually getting individuals from curative care over to palliative care, and then there would be a handoff to specialists in hospice care. But sometimes people were dying outside of the hospice care situation. And as a social worker, I was principally around the issues of providing resources and linking individuals to the resources that they have available to them. And one of the principles of hospice care that really becomes a part of how the hospice team works with the family and the individual who is dying is the sense of control. Now, when somebody's going through the dying process and they're going through that cycle, Kubler-Ross's cycle, and being in different places, one of the things that becomes pretty apparent is the body is sort of, I'll use the word betraying. It's not, but the body's on its own. It's doing its thing, and there's certainly there can arise from that a sense of lack of control over this vehicle that I've been in for my entire life and used to experience my life. And that sense of loss of control can be mitigated by helping the individual focus on the things that they do have control in. So control and decision making is very, very important. As much as we might like to intervene and lift the burdens of responsibility and decision making from the individual who's dying, it actually has the opposite effect. Because they have lost control over so many things, particularly their body and the dying process, allowing them to partake in as many normal decision-making processes as possible helps them regain a sense of that control over things and aspects of their life. So don't take it away. And obviously don't overburden people with decisions like it's up to you every night what we have for dinner now and stuff like that. But allowing individuals to continue to have a say in how things are going, as hard as that conversation can be, is vitally important for that individual if they're going to experience, I guess, what we call a quote-unquote good death. An individual who went out feeling supported, in as much control as possibly can imagine in that situation, and be able to make as many decisions as they could. Now, one of the areas that was the focus of my particular work was the whole world of advance directives. Now, advance directives are documents. You might have heard of a living will, but advance directives is a much better term, because advance means ahead of time, directing my care ahead of time, to making sure people know what I want right out front. Now, there's legality involved in these documents, so let's go through the kind of levels of legality. First, there's the living will. The living will is a document where individuals identify whether or not they want to be put on extreme, what would be termed extreme life support systems if they're on their way to dying. And many people will say, nope, just give me no pain, but don't force feed me. Don't keep me alive just to keep my body alive. Let me go. And they check off boxes and they sign it, goes into their medical record, and they have communicated at that point what their wishes are in terms of the interventions that would happen when they're actively dying, because they may or may not be able to talk. They may not be able to tell people what they want, because that would be, if someone's awake, obviously you just ask them. But if they're not, we have to kind of make decisions. The people there make a decision that everybody that you could possibly want should know about what you want as your advance directives, and you hope they want to go with it. But an advance directive is not legally binding. A son, daughter, and there's a pecking order, the husband, say that if the husband's still around or the wife's still around, they can say, no, keep them alive. And she can override that living will. Then there's the power of attorney. Now, a power of attorney is a legal document for lots of things. And there's one called a healthcare power of attorney. And that is basically, I tell the medical community, it's basically kind of a release. You can talk to this person and they can participate in the decision-making process. Both of these documents that I've signed, the living will and the power of attorney, are dependent on my ability to purposefully give that permission. Now, it's a little difficult to understand, but it all has to do with competence. An individual who's competent, cognitively aware enough to make decisions. The power of a power of attorney and the power of a living will rest with the individual themselves. As long as I can still make decisions, these are still in place. If a person becomes unable to make their own decisions, they become incompetent, and that's how there's tests for that, and they determine the person is incompetent now to make those decisions. In truth, both those documents become null and void. That's not what happens in practice. Power of attorneys, sometimes a little overbound, can feel that they are legal representatives of the person. That is not true, but it's not that it doesn't occur. I mean, sometimes power of attorneys just kind of take over, and we need to be on the watch for that. And politically, you kind of have to work with that. an individual becomes overbearing, you're not going to sit there and say, well, legally you can't do that. There's only certain circumstances you'd want to do that, but certainly it can become an overbearing situation, or it can be a life, it'd be great. The individuals is helping the individual make the best decisions that they can and whatnot. There's a third level of document, and in the process of my work on advanced directives, my goal was often to convince my patients to move to that third level. It's a little dicey, but it carries with it a little bit more power. Now, what it is a durable medical power of attorney. Now, the durable medical power of attorney needs to be witnessed and it needs to be notarized. It is a very legally binding document. And what it does is it names an individual similar to a power of attorney, a regular power of attorney, regular healthcare power of attorney. However, the durable quality means that this document will remain in effect even if I become incompetent and unable to make my own decisions, which is sort of the point. And so when you get to that level, you're picking somebody. Now, that individual needs to be someone you hope is going to carry out your wishes. It's something really that, as a social worker, I sat down with families and we kind of hashed it all out. What does, the patient's right there. I'm in early. They're not that close to dying yet. And say, what do you want? We write it down, like, who can guarantee, who's not going to break down, who's not going to, who wants to carry this out? Who's going to be the strong one to carry out Grandpa's wishes when Grandpa can't do that anymore? And that's who, I would at least suggest that individual become the durable medical power of attorney. They can override everybody. And it can't be your doctor. They won't do it. And so it's something to consider is identifying people in your life. If you're married, your spouse often has that capacity, such as a durable medical power of attorney. But outside of that circumstance, and truthfully, if you don't want your spouse to be the one responsible for that because, they're going to be, they're going to be busy, then you can designate someone else and who would carry out those wishes and communicating it to everybody so nobody's feeling wrong, nobody's feeling left out, those kind of things. That's kind of the work I did for a while. It was very fascinating, very heart-wrenching sometimes, but in the end, a very, very valuable process for individuals to go through as they prepared for their own deaths. Now, how does death impact people around you? So this kind of, again, that sociological view. We look at the loss of parents, the loss of children, that kind of dichotomy there. Now, when we look at these two things from a psychological point of view, there's a great scene in The Lord of the Rings where the king of, I should have looked up these names before I did this, but the king of the horses loses his son. He wakes up from the spell and he's lost his son, Cedric, I think it is. And there's a scene of him standing by Cedric's grave and he says to Gandalf, no parent should live long enough to see the death of their children. There's something wrong with that. That's not supposed to be the way it works. And the scene emotionally captures that moment of an individual losing their children. It's the wrong order of things. Losing your parents, it is hard, it's difficult, but it's logical. It's the way things are supposed to go. So how we experience those things when death seems wrong, out of order, it's a very different psychological experience. Individuals that have gone through the death of their parents can become depressed. It can be extremely devastating, and I would not ever minimize that. And for some individuals, it's a pain they carry for the rest of their lives. I have met a few individuals who have lost children, and that is almost always something that they carry for the rest of their lives. I was actually sitting in on a grieving group several years ago, and there was an elderly woman there who at age 18 had a miscarriage. She had had other children since that time, but that miscarriage still tore her up. And she was a revered elder in this group, but she came and she says, I grieve that loss every day. And she was like 80 something. And I'm not saying that she was dealing with this as best she could. She wasn't dysfunctional. She wasn't losing it. But she said, I still need to come here. And I still need to be with other people who understand what that loss means. Because it's so out of the order of things. So we kind of compare these notions of losing a parent, which, even though it can be devastating, is sort of the cycle of life. Losing a child being what many would think is the most detrimental thing that can happen. Caregivers also, caregivers who are related, but also the caregivers professionally. This is for all of you healthcare people out there. And you are working with a patient, and you're in their home or in hospice or in the hospital, and they die, and it has an effect on you. We don't get into these fields because we're heartless. We get into them because we care. And the solution to that is not a stone cold heart. It's to understand that we go through the process of grieving as well. I've lost clients, and to this day I can name them. The clients that I lost in mental health and who had decided to end their own lives, I remember all of them. And it's still a part of me. It's a part of the bricks that build who I am. And the embracing that loss as a caregiver and understanding that it's okay for me to be sad about that. It's okay for me to wish things were different. And it's okay for me to process that. So as caregivers working together when there is a death, how important it is for caregivers to come together and support one another. You and the family and the entire community are going through similar processes of loss. And so it's important to be able to support one another through those processes. There's the processes of mourning, that whole cornucopia of feelings and activities and whatnot, and engaging in the rites and the rituals and funerals and where religion comes in, and all of these things are mechanisms that our society has done to bring people together who are experiencing a shared loss in order to spread the responsibility of that, in order to provide care when it's needed, and how important these things are. And I've attended several life-moving events. I've been to a celebration of life where they roasted him. Everybody, his friends, is my children's grandfather who died in a head-on collision, out of his time. I mean, it was just not. It was a tragic death. Yet, tons of people went up and told their wildest stories about Bob and the healing of those sharing of stories, because everybody knew him and everybody knew those are the kinds of things that he did. And I've been to a very somber and incredibly surprising a client of mine who I'd known for years, and I knew the family very well. His stepfather passed away, and I was invited to the funeral, and it was a full military funeral, and I had not been to one of those, and it was striking how solemn and important that event was for everybody that was there. And truth be told, I didn't even know he was in the military, and he was a very highly decorated pilot in World War II. And so there was that whole thing, and but ultimately those two events were to help people get together and process the memory of that individual, to work out the connections with the people that shared love and affection for that individual, and to help each other grieve and move on with their lives. So important events in our lives, to go to these, to participate in these rites and events. Now for our discussion this week, obviously focusing on your own personal experiences with death, death of family members or a pet even. It really is a shared experience here. All of those things ring at a similar bell. And so sharing those experiences with each other, good, bad, and ugly. You know, certainly we want to get a nice mix of your experiences in there, and so you can have that diversity in the class. And then the assignment is really having to do with exploring the experience of loss, the generic experience of loss itself that you have had and your subject has had. Now, your biographies are already in, but reaching out to that individual again and saying, you know, how have you experienced loss? And that's, again, one of the reasons I like to have a person who's older is because likely they have, you know, almost guaranteed they've experienced personal loss. Could be a loss of an individual. Could it also be a loss of their identity, loss of a business, loss of whatever. Loss has that sort of universal quality to it, and reflecting on that, you know, obviously the details are in the course book. So we come to an end. There's a little bit of this idea of endings and dying involved in the creation of this last video. Here we are. We've been on this journey together as a class. We've gone through the material. We haven't had the opportunity to really meet physically, face to face, but we got to know each other. We went through a process as a group. To accomplish the task of me teaching and you learning, and certainly me learning as well about human development, and we're coming to an end of that. And I ask you to take a moment to appreciate that we've had this opportunity to be together and learn from each other, and because our group is going to disband. And we're going to go in our separate ways, and maybe we're running to each other in future classes, or some of you are going off to green pastures and whatever. And I'm not implying anything about death on that, but the endings are as important to recognize as beginnings, and to give them their due. And you've done a journey. You've worked hard. You should celebrate. You should celebrate that it's done. I'm sure when you submitted that last assignment, you know, like, woo! And then, and give yourself a pat on the back, and reach out to your classmates. Thank them for what they've given to you. With the stories that we've shared have certainly enriched our lives and enriched the material. That's one of the best things I like about online learning is everybody has to talk. And so we get a lot more knowledge about each other, a lot of sharing. And this class has been particularly open about sharing things and about their personal lives and whatnot. And I, for one, totally appreciate the impact that has, both on the class quality and on me as a person, experiencing the trust that you have in this environment. So I thank you all for that. So I wish you well for this last week of work. I will obviously see you in the discussions. The class will be ending at the end of this week. I'm in grading madness for a while and getting those final grades out. And then, of course, the world doesn't stop. So if there's any questions, you can still reach out to me. And I wish you all the best in your future endeavors, and I hope to possibly see some. I'm teaching all face-to-face classes in the fall, and it'd be wonderful to have some of you in some of those classes. So I will sign off for now. It's been a great experience. Thank you for a great summer, and I look forward to reading these biographies. I'm going to be starting those tomorrow, and really looking forward to the little glimpses that I've got in some of these quizzes and assignments related to your biography have really piqued my interest in some of the people that you're interviewing. So I'll be in touch, and have a great week.